Hey guys, we are now looking at chapter 6. Chapter 6 material will be on the second exam. I know you may be watching this video before the first exam, but the material you learn on this will not be on that first exam. But this is also the first body system that we are going to look at in anatomy. We've sort of been building this up because we started with what is living things and what is anatomy and physiology. Then we talked about living things like cells and their components and what they do as their metabolism. Moving on to tissues. And now finally, you're going to get a body system. And when we look at this body system, we're going to talk about the cells and the parts and pieces, about the tissues, and then about what it does. And that's sort of the theme that you'll take for each of these different body systems. And then at the end, we sort of talk about what happens as we age and what can sort of go wrong, illnesses and disease. And again, that's sort of a recurring theme as you go through these different body systems. So let's go ahead and start looking at the integumentary system. Here are your objectives. Again, they look sort of short. There's only 3 of them, but they are a little in depth about knowing the different layers, the different structures, what they do, degrees of burns, how tissues repair, sweat glands, nails, acne, hair, and then how it receives stimuli. So, what is the integumentary system? Well, it is your largest organ. It's your skin. It makes up about 7% of your body weight. It covers the body and consists of skin and any accessory tissues to the skin. Things like nails, hair, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands. When we talk about integument, we're talking about skin. Another way that we can call the integumentary system or skin is to call it the cutaneous membrane. And of course, we know from just living our everyday life that the integumentary system is our barrier from our body to the outside world. So, what does the integumentary system do? Well, again, it's going to depend on if it's the skin, the hair, the glands, or the nails. But in general, the job of the integumentary system is protection, to protect against abrasion and to protect against ultraviolet light, to prevent microorganisms from entering the internal workings of the body, and to prevent desiccation or dehydration. It also works to detect sensation or stimuli. It's filled with sensory receptors that can detect heat, cold, touch, pressure, and pain. It works to control temperature, and that will happen by either allowing or restricting blood flow through the skin, as well as either ramping up or shutting down sweat gland activity. It plays a very major role in producing vitamin D, and it is used to excrete small waste products. Usually that's happening in those sweat glands. Let's break the integument down into some major regions, and then we'll look at each of those regions specifically. So we'll start with the epidermis. Epidermis is the outermost or most superficial region. Really, its main goal is going to be to protect against abrasions and cuts and that friction from the outside world. It also works to reduce water loss. So it's going to keep water in the body and prevent it from being evaporated away. The middle layer, that's like the bulk of it, is going to be called the dermis. And that is responsible for all of the structural strength and components of the skin. And just a really fun fact, leather is produced from the dermis in animals. Then you've got the subcutaneous tissue. Sometimes that's called the hypodermis. That's the deepest region. It's technically not part of the integumentary system. It's just like the basement bottom layer, but it is going to sort of provide things to the skin layer, and it's what connects the skin to the muscle or bone that is underneath it. So let's talk about the different layers more in depth. And this is just one picture representation from your book. Your lab manual will also have this sort of chart. There's some videos here. So this is just a very brief overview of the different layers. And of course, we'll dive more into them, but also if this is a good way to organize information for you, then great. Stick with this chart. So again, the epidermis, right? That's the uppermost layer. That's the part you see when you're looking at skin on a person. And again, it's that barrier to prevent water loss. It's protection against abrasion and microorganisms entering. And it has different layers. The first is called the stratum corneum. That has about 25 or so layers of dead squamous cells on it. Underneath that is the stratum luteum, and that is going to be dead cells, and they appear transparent or clear because they're lacking the nucleus. So we don't find this in every part of the skin, but we'll find it on places that have what we call thick skin. And thick skin is like the sole of your feet or the palm of your hands. It's just sort of an extra layer in those highly used areas that need a little extra protection. Then you've got the stratum granulosum. It's called that because it looks like there are these little granules of keratin. That's a protein. And it's like 2 to 5-ish layers thick. This is also the layer in which the cells that were living are going to die. So the top 3-ish layers of your skin are dead cells. Then we've got the stratum spinosum. It gets its name from the meaning of like spiny layer. And it's called that because we have a lot of desmosomes, those junctions to hold cells together. And we also have Langerhans cells there, which are immune cells, and they're kind of spiky looking. So you can think of that spinosum as like spiny or spiky. Then you've got the stratum basale, and that's the deepest layer of your epidermis. It's what's going to touch the dermis, and it is going to be like the basement layer. And this is where we have living cells. We have keratinocytes that are living in there. Um, Random fact as well, for those of you that like comparative anatomy, this is the layer of cells in which we're making those keratinocytes, which is what also makes hoofs and horns on animals. The next deepest layer after we do the whole epidermis and its layers is the dermis. Okay. The dermis has what we call the papillary layer, and it has these papillae, or sort of like finger-like bumpy projections that go up towards the epidermis. It's going to bring blood vessels close to the epidermis. It's also those ridges and layers are what makes your fingerprints. And then we've got the reticular layer that is just like collagen and elastin. It's really strong and helps to work to keep shape when we have like friction and pull and stress. It is going to make what we call cleavage lines. So when you are like stitching up a wound or you get a cut, it is what will determine how long it takes to heal that wound, and if you have a visible scar or if it's able to sort of blend in. And we'll talk more about that coming up. And then again, the subcutaneous tissue, that's the hypodermis. And that's not really part of this, but it does have a lot of adipose tissue in it, and areolar tissue. It's going to be attaching the dermis to these structures underneath it, like bones or muscles. Okay, so let's take a look at the epidermis. Again, it's the outermost region. When we look at the cell type, we're going to see that it is keratinized, stratified, squamous. And there are going to be four distinct types and 4 or 5 layers. Some of those cell types that we're going to see are those keratinocytes, which are making or having keratin in them. Melanocytes having melanin, which is going to produce the color of the skin. Merkel cells, which I am not related to, but maybe somewhere distantly, that would be cool. But those are involved in like sensation and touch, sensing things. And then the Langerhans cells, which are immune response cells. And of course, this epidermis is that outer portion that is exposed to the environment, and its main job is protection. So, we just talked about the types of cell layers here in a chart, but let's look at it sort of as a picture. We have these keratinocytes, which is incredibly abundant, the most abundant in the epidermis. It's going to make keratin. Keratin is that protein that we find in skin, in hair, in nails. And it is a protein that is going to allow the skin to do that protective function. It will make the skin almost waterproof. It's very selectively permeable. Then we've got melanocytes, which is what is going to produce melanin. Melanin is a brown pigment. It's found in the deeper layers of our epidermis. And there is this misconception that if you have more melanocytes, that you have darker skin, but it's not really the number of those cells, it's the amount of pigment that determines the skin color. Then we have what we call epidermal dendritic cells, or those Langerhausen cells. Those are the immune cells. They help in the immune system and sort of set a signal if there's a cut or if there is a bacteria or other pathogen that gets into the skin. They're the ones that alert the immune system to fight off that infection. And then we've got the Merkel cells, also called tactile cells. They're very few in number. They sort of look like spider webby, but they are touch receptors that have a nerve ending associated with them. And so when you feel touch or sensation on your skin, they've been activated and they will release chemicals to those nerve endings that then sends to your brain to make a response. Let's look at the different layers. We'll start at the bottom. The stratum basale is the basal layer. It's the deepest. It's what's attached to the dermis. When you look at it in a microscope, it's really going to be a single row of these brand new keratinocytes. And they're mostly shaped cuboidally, sort of like little dice. Could be column as well, but usually pretty square shaped. And they are very active in regenerating or reproducing. So they're going to undergo divisions about every 19 days. And when we look at it, we're seeing that 10 to 25% of the cells that we're seeing here will be those melanocytes that are holding pigment. If we move up a layer to our stratum spinosum, that spiny layer, that is going to be these like polygon shapes, so sort of irregular shapes, keratinocytes. They are coming from the stratum basale. So like the stratum basale is doing that mitosis and those cells are getting pushed up. These keratinocytes do not divide. They're attached with those desmosomes, so the cell junctions to keep them together. And here we will see melanin granules and epidermal dendritic cells, so nerve cells, are very abundant. And those melanin granules are getting taken in by the keratinocytes and they accumulate on the top or sunny side layer. And really, the main job of melanin is to protect the nucleus of the skin cells from ultraviolet light. And it is one of the reasons that evolutionarily, if you look at skin color, um, people that live near the equator have this darker skin tone so that we can block the UV light because there is more of it at the equator. And then people that historically moved out of that region and moved to northern regions have lighter skin tones because they do not need as much pigment to block the UV light because there's not as much. Next layer is our stratum granulosum, and that is that grainy layer. We are going to see this really drastic change in these keratinocytes because they start to fill up with those granules. We see that the nucleus and the other organelles are going to start to disintegrate and the cells die in this layer. Next is our stratum lucidum or lucidum. That's that thin, transparent layer. It it's just a few layers thick. They're all dead. There's no nucleus. But again, it's not present everywhere on the body. It's just present in areas that we call thick skin. And that's really concentrated on like your hands, the soles of the feet, any areas that are going to undergo a lot of mechanical stress, like, walking, touching things, climbing, grabbing, that sort of thing, will have that thick skin. It's just an extra protective layer. But when you do look at it under a microscope, it looks clear. There's no nucleus. There's not really the granules. It's this extra layer. Then you've got the stratum corneum. That's the outermost layer. It is all keratinized. It's about 3/4 of the epidermal thickness. So it's like 20 to 30 layers of cells, and it's all been pushed up from that basal layer. This is what rubs off of your body every day, or if you use like an exfoliant when you shower or you get a pedicure, it's like what they're sloughing off of you. So you have a totally new um, skin, basically, about 25 to 45 days. And that's just from that sloughing off. And how do we see that sloughing off if we're not like, getting a pedicure and seeing it? Dust in your house is a lot of dead skin cells. And what is the main purpose of this layer? Well, it's waterproofing. It's keeping the moisture inside of your body, and so it's not evaporating, dehydrating, desiccating. It's also that protection from abrasion. It's protection from any sort of penetration into the body. And really, it is rendering the body insensitive to the environment around it, any sort of biological, chemical, physical assaults. Your internal organs rely on the skin as that protection. Otherwise, every single day, it would be this biological, chemical, physical assault to those organs. So, thank you, skin. You're pretty great. Here's what it would look like under a microscope for you. So, of course, that stratum corneum, right? Dead, flat, keratinized cells. They're showing you this clear layer, stratum lucidum or lucidum, for you. Again, not present everywhere. Then you can see the stratum granulosum. You can see like the little dots. It's very grainy. That's where we get the name for that layer. The stratum spinosum, it's kind of hard to see in this picture. Sometimes you can like blow it up and see lots of those desmosomes, the little cell junctions that look sort of spiky. And then you've got your stratum basale, that one layer connecting it to the dermis part. And again, here's how that growth sort of happens here. We've got the stratum basale. They're doing mitosis there in that base layer. And as they do mitosis, it's pushing those cells upwards. We can see in the stratum spinosum that we have all of these cell junctions sticking the cells very closely together. We're starting to accumulate some of these granules of keratin or melanin. As you then move up to the granulosum, you're really accumulating those little granules, and the nucleus and organelles are disintegrating. This is where your cells will die. If there's a stratum lucidum, then there's no more nucleus. It's a clear layer. And then as you go to the stratum corneum, that is going to be that more hardened, waterproofed, containing keratin cells. They're all dead. And then that very, very top part of that stratum corneum that's exposed to the environment, that's what sloughs off. And then you will replace it with the cells underneath. So, what is this thick skin versus thin skin stuff? So, what is this thick skin versus thin skin stuff? So, thick skin is the palm of your hands, the soles of your feet. It has all 5 layers of that epidermal strata. It has sweat glands, but it doesn't have hair follicles or sebaceous glands. Its sebaceous glands we'll see are like the oil glands. Thin skin, which covers basically the rest of the body, it is not going to have that stratum lucidium. It does have sweat glands. It does have hair follicles. It does have sebaceous glands. So really, again, it's just that area that might need a slightly more protection because of stress that it's going through, right? Walking, grabbing, touching stuff. And so it doesn't have the hair or the oil, but it will have sweat glands, whereas the rest of your body will have sweat glands, hair follicles, and those oil glands. All right, so skin color, again, the normal color of your skin will be a mix from the blood that you can see through the skin, your melanin, and keratin. So blood vessels, we know that that's not a pigment, but there is this bright red blood vessel that is bringing blood to the skin and giving that sort of orangey, pink, red undertone. Then melanin is that dark pigment, sort of this brown colored pigment produced by the melanocytes that then moves to the keratinocytes. And the amount in the skin will vary, and that can be based on your genetics or based on UV exposure, like suntan. And then a condition called albinism is when your melanocytes can't make melanin. And again, it's not the number of these cells, it's the amount of pigment in them. And then carotene, that's a yellow-orange pigment that we can acquire from vegetables. I'm of an age group that I watched Magic School Bus as a kid, and there is an episode where one of the students eats a bunch of these chips and it turns their skin orange. And of course, Miss Frizzle and the Magic School Bus go and investigate. But that is true. You can eat things that will give you more of an orange yellow pigment, possibly. So here's that melanin and melanocytes. What's happening is that you are making this melanin in the melanocytes, and these melanocytes have these little processes or like finger projections. They're kind of squiggly looking. And these keratinocytes will actually like scoop up those little pieces and then incorporate it into blocking their nucleus and their DNA. And so, of course, as we're pushing up those layers of skin, we are bringing that color with us, if that makes sense. When we're looking at skin color, it can be really important for diagnosing illness or disease, or just, checking that a person is doing okay. Um, if you've got increased blood flow, your skin can turn more red. And this can happen when you're blushing, or if you work out and your face gets red, then you're suffering this condition of erythema. And usually that will go away if in a little bit of time, as that blood sort of leaves that upper area of the skin. And then if we lose that blood flow, we can get pale skin. Cyanosis is when the oxygen content in the blood is low, and therefore it results in this bluish or purple looking color. And we see that especially like in extremities, like in the digits. Like this picture here, you can see like a blue color. And then that would indicate that there is an oxygen issue in the body. Again, albinism, that is a genetically inherited condition. The enzyme that you need to make melanin doesn't work, so therefore we lack melanin. And so we would see, instead of like a color in hair and nails and skin, it would be pale, very pale. And here's sort of that example of turning skin orange. This is an adorable little baby, but basically they've eaten a lot of carotene containing um, foods, and so it can give the skin a sort of orange tint. Usually you just eat slightly less and it goes back to that normal, more pinkish undertone from the blood, basically. When we talk about skin, we have to talk about some dermatology stuff. Dermatology is just the study of the skin, basically. And one thing that we would look for on the epidermis is skin markings. So we can have something called a nevus, that's otherwise known as a mole. And that's just a localized overgrowth of melanocytes. These are usually benign and everyone has them somewhere on their body, but they should be monitored for any changes, because changes in it can suggest that it has become malignant, cancerous. Then there are freckles. Those are usually sort of yellow or brownish spots. That's very localized areas where we see more melanocytes. And again, these can be totally normal and fine, but they, also you can monitor. Maybe if you're in the sun more, you see more of them. In the sun less, you see them less. That's good to monitor. Okay, let's leave the epidermis and let's go to the dermis. And the dermis is deep, or like underneath the epidermis. It's going to be made up of connective tissue. There are several other structures that are there, including blood vessels, sweat glands, sebaceous sweat glands, hair follicles, sensory nerve endings, and what we call an erecti pili muscle, which makes your hair stand up. And it is going to be made of 2 layers. First layer being the papillary layer, and then the reticular layer. So what is this papillary layer? That is going to be like the superficial or upper region of the dermis. It consists of areolar connective tissue, and its surface is sort of like these bumpy ridges or like peg-like projections that we call dermal papillae. This dermal papillae pattern is genetically determined. It is unique to each person, barring like identical twin situations. And it is responsible for your fingerprints and your footprints, which are really just very thin layers of like oily sweat. This layer is also going to be where we have blood vessels that is going to give nutrients and oxygen, take away waste from that overlying epidermis. It's also what helps regulate body temperature, right? We can allow more or less blood to that skin area. That lower part is called the reticular layer. It's made of dense, irregular connective tissue, and it makes up about 80% of the skin's thickness. In that layer, we're going to find collagen fibers to add strength and that resiliency, and elastin fibers to help stretch and then bring back. This reticular layer that has that elastin and collagen, they have them oriented in more than one direction on the body. So it makes what we call lines of cleavage. And those lines of cleavage are really important if you're trying to patch up a wound. So again, those lines of cleavage important when you're making an incision or trying to like fix a wound. If the incision is like parallel to those cleavage lines, it's going to heal more quickly and the scar won't be as visible because it's sort of going with the grain. If you have an incision that's perpendicular to those cleavage lines, it is going to take longer to heal and it most likely will make a more visible scar because you've cut more of that elastic fiber. So you've sort of reduced that ability to recoil. And this is not incredibly vital to your everyday life, but it is why some wounds seem to heal real easily and with, quickly, and then other wounds, um, seem to take more time to heal. And if you're like me, you get cuts and bruises all the time that you have no idea like what chair you bumped into or, where that they came from. And so this is just a fascinating little part of that, I guess. Okay, and then also this reticular layer that is full of this dense, irregular connective tissue. You can see striae or stretch marks when the skin is overstretched and the dermis actually ruptures, and then we can see these visible lines. So this is common when you've overstretched the skin, if you've gained a lot of weight and then lost it, or if you've been pregnant and then you had your baby. Any place that you've broken that dermis, you can see these visible lines. There is some treatment that is sort of helpful. I know though, like vitamin E is really touted as a great system, but ultimately, um, it's hard to heal that rupture. It doesn't really ever go 100% back. So you can save some of your money on those special lotions, I guess. Also, in the reticular layer, you will find tactile receptors. So feeling touch, those vibrations and pressure need to be taken up by something so that it can send it to the brain. So you have what we call Passian corpuscles and Messener's corpuscles. The word corpuscle is just a fancy word for like body or structure. So it's just these structures or these bodies that can sense a stimuli. Those Passian corpuscles are the deep pressure, so they detect heavy pressure and vibration. The Messener's corpuscles, they're abundant on your hairless portion of your skin, so like the thick skin, and they're for more fine touch, so less pressure, less force, and it's what helps you to distinguish between 2 points. And if you have a minute or two and want to do a little kind of fun experiment, grab a paper clip or a staple or something that has 2 fine points sort of close-ish together. And if you close your eyes and you touch it to the palm of your hand, you'll tell that it's, two little pieces of metal a certain distance apart. But if you touch it to like the side of your arm, there becomes a point where it's really hard to distinguish that it's two separate points. And that's basically due to this Messner corpuscle being more abundant um, on like your hands, where you would need more fine touch skills. So let's talk about tattoos. Many people have them. I have tattoos. They are permanent images that are put into the integuments. You inject the dye into that dermis layer, and that dermis layer is then, showing that through the other layers of your skin. But it's a permanent process, and it's usually pretty impossible to completely remove a tattoo. The lasers are there to break down the pigments, and some pigments break down and are hidden more easily. As you can see in the picture here, right, the blue is kind of hard to get rid of, but the red and the yellow do fade. But there are newer inks being made that now allow for easier removal, which is an interesting concept, I think, because most people get a tattoo wanting it there for forever. Um, but now there are ways in which we are making them easier to remove should you want that. Let's go ahead and talk about that subcutaneous tissue or the hypodermis, the part that's not really part of the skin. It's more of an accessory at best, but it is important for the body and we have to put it somewhere. So why not put it here? It's mostly made of adipose and areolar connective tissue. It's going to be a storage place. Like adipose is fat, and we're storing energy in those bonds. It's protection. It's able to absorb shock. It's an insulator to help regulate heat and temperature in the body. And this is the layer where when you get injectable drugs, that's where you're putting it. So like a shot, the goal is to get to that layer. Why? Well, there's a whole bunch of blood vessels, an extensive vascular network, if you will, that is going to allow rapid absorption of whatever has been injected into that layer. We also want to talk about some of these modifications or accessory organs. Nails. Nails are just this scale-like modification of the stratum corneum or that uppermost dermis layer. They are essentially for gripping, protecting the distal tips of your fingers and toes. When you look at a nail, you have the free edge, that's like the top part. Or if you're getting like a French manicure, it's the part that you would paint white. Then it's the nail body. That's like the big chunk of the nail that you see that you would like put nail polish on. And then the nail root, that's the part that's like connected to the finger. Underneath the nail is the nail bed. And then the surrounding cuticle part is also called the epipocynum, which is why we just call it the cuticle. And really, for our purposes in our course, that's all you need to know. But if it, nails and how they work and about them is something interesting to you, there is more in our manual and more on the D2L about nails. But really, as long as you know this slide about nails, you are good. Hair, we need to know a little bit more about. Hair is just a bunch of dead keratinized epithelial cells that are in these long columns. Each hair is going to have a hair shaft, which is what you see above the skin. It's going to have a hair root, that's the part that goes below the skin, and the hair bulb, that's where we actually form the hair. Each hair also has an erecti pili muscle, which is a smooth muscle that is going to allow the hair to stand on end or give you like goosebumps or goose flesh. And this is more noticeable in the animal kingdom when animals are trying to establish a territory, or they're scared or want to fight. They want to look bigger than they are. They can puff up their hair, make it stand on end. In the human world, we retained that, but really just as like goosebumps. We also want to talk about sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are a type of holocrine gland. And remember, the whole thing is what is involved in secreting the product. They're found all over the body except on your palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. It is really there to soften the skin and to keep it like lubricated. And it gets stimulated by hormones. So it makes this oily secretion that lubricates hair and skin. It does have bactericidal properties to it, so to keep bacterial infections sort of at bay. But what it's probably most known for is acne. And acne is just this inflammation of this sebaceous gland. So normally you'll have this gland, you'll get trapped dead skills or dead skin cells, trapped oil. And if it's just, a little bit impacted and trapped, that's sort of mild acne. But if it continues to stay trapped, you can actually rupture the gland entirely. And then that would inflame the tissue underneath, and that's like the raised red bump, painful acne. Of course, treatment for it, many different things. That like washing your face with a good cleanser to stop that trapping of dead skin and oil. Um, Not touching it when you have a pimple. I know my first reaction is like Dr. Pimple Popper, and I want to squish it, but you really shouldn't. That can aggravate it more and cause that rupture. Of course, then there are medications as well if it is an inflammatory response issue. Then sweat glands. There are different types of sweat glands to prevent the body from overheating. You have merocrine sweat glands that are going to make sweat that cools the body. And this is very common on the body and also on the palms and soles of the feet. This is that watery sweat. It doesn't really have a smell to it. It's really there when your body overheats. You release the water and some salts. It evaporates away and it cools your body. Then there is the apocrine sweat glands, which is found in your armpits and genital areas. those empty onto hair follicles. And that is going to make this secretion that gets broken down by bacteria. And that's when you have sweat that has an odor to it. It's not your sweat necessarily that has that odor, it's the bacteria breaking it down. But those are the type of sweat glands that produce that odor causing sweat. Sort of a modified sweat gland, I guess you can call it. We have got our Simonius glands, which are a modified apocrine gland in the ear, and that's what gives you earwax. And I know that there are Q-tips and, ear candles and all of that kind of stuff to remove that earwax, but really it's self-cleaning. It doesn't need you to go in there. And by doing those things, you actually could damage your eardrum. The purpose of earwax is really to keep gross, nasty things out of your eardrum and your ear canal. Though there are conditions that people have where they need to get, excess wax removed, and that can be done by a trained medical professional. And then mammary glands, we've talked very shortly about, but they are specialized sweat glands that secrete milk. They are mostly hormonally stimulated. And then, of course, that is a positive feedback stimulation as well. Okay, shifting gears entirely from the skin parts and pieces and glands and moving on to another thing that your skin does for you, it produces vitamin D. How does that all work? Well, you do need to have some exposure to UV light. So while we know that like tanning beds and being out in the sun all day, every single day, is maybe not so good for your skin, it can cause damage. You do need some exposure to sunlight. When you have that exposure to sunlight, the keratinocytes in the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum, they get hit, they get activated, and they can make this cholesterol related molecule. Um, and it's okay that you don't know the name of it, it's not a big deal. But it is going to convert it into D3, which does not yet work. That inactive vitamin D3 molecule goes to the liver. And in the liver, we get our intermediate product that then eventually can be transferred and made into vitamin D. Vitamin D is important in building strong muscles and bones. It's a nutrient you do need. So, especially older women who are more susceptible to things like osteoporosis, they may even take supplements of it. But normal people, as long as you're getting some exposure to daylight, your body is making the D3 that you need. So yeah, here's that process that intermediate is going to be traveling to the kidneys, and then we are making calcitrol from it. So calcitrol is going to be involved in absorbing calcium, especially in the bones. Okay, let's talk now again about something entirely different from D3 and vitamin D and calcitrol. We are wanting to repair and regenerate the integumentary system, right? Its main goal is to prevent damage, but in that process, it itself could be damaged. So, tissue can be repaired in sort of two ways. We can have regeneration, which is where we replace the damaged or dead cells with the same type of cells. So, we're going to want to restore the function of the skin. We just want to replace what was lost there. So maybe you got a small cut or a scrape, and we just want to replace those cells. Okay. Then there's fibrosis, which is the second type. And that's when you've got a more extensive damage to the skin, an incision. It can go through more layers than just, the epidermis. That is where we need to fill this gap with scar tissue in order to sort of heal up that wound. And to do that, we will get fibroblasts, and those fibroblasts will make collagen, and it will repair that area, but the normal function of that space is not restored. So if you have a scar on your body, whether it's from surgery or an injury or whatever, it's not going to like have sweat and hair and do the same function as the skin around it. And that's just because of that collagen produced by the fibroblasts. We also should talk about burns. There are degrees of burns. A first-degree burn is just the epidermis is damaged. And that is where we see reddening, maybe a little bit of swelling. It's painful to the touch. It might feel warm. A great example is just a mild sunburn, or maybe you're cooking on the stove and you touch a hot pot and you let it go. And some treatments, aloe, putting a cool compress on it, but really it'll heal over a few days. It's very minor. You're just damaging that upper epidermis area. A second degree burn is a little bit more serious. You've got the epidermis and the upper regions of the dermis being damaged. At first, you'll see the same effects of a first degree burn. It'll feel red, might feel hot, painful, some swelling. But then you will see that there are blisters filled with fluid that appear as well. And you can get some scarring from a second degree burn. Treatment for this is still pretty much the same though. A cool compress, some aloe. Do not puncture the blisters. Let them, do their immune response and then recede on their own. More serious, but this is still a sunburn that this person has in this picture. And then a third degree burn, that is very serious. That is the epidermis, dermis, and that subcutaneous layer. The burned areas are going to be white and gray. They can also be like bright cherry red, maybe even black. There's no swelling or pain because you've completely destroyed the nerve endings. Those corpuscles and nerve endings are gone. So you don't even really feel anything from this type of burn. A third degree burn does require hospitalization. You're going to have to treat for dehydration because the skin was keeping moisture in the body is now gone, as well as infection because you've now exposed those inner organs to the outside world. You'll want to have an increased caloric intake in order to, help the body fight the infection in order to heal. There will be severe scarring, and you may need debridement, which is just like removing debris, and skin grafting, taking healthy skin from somewhere else and putting it there so that it can regenerate, basically. So first degree burn, we've all probably been there, felt that. Second degree burn, if you're more pale skin like I am, you've gotten a second degree sunburn at some point, or if you like cooking, you've touched a pot a little too long. But third degree burn, that is dangerous and does require medical help because it can be dangerous and be even life threatening. So again, we call these things first degree and second degree burns, but in the medical field, we also might call them partial thickness burn, which is really first and second degree burns. And then full thickness burn is a third degree burn. You can see, either getting that dermis and epidermis layer, like a second or first degree burn, or even getting to the subcutaneous tissue being that third degree burn. And we said, like these burns may or may not be serious. Do I need help with it? There is this rule of nines to estimate burn severity. And it's sort of a rounding type of estimate. But you're dividing the body into areas that are about 9-ish% of the total body. Younger patients, that's different. But burns are considered critical if over 25% of the body has a second degree burn. So if you got a sunburn that was second degree, but it was over a lot of your body, that would still be, something you may want to get some medical treatment for. If over 10% of the body has a third degree burn, or if there's third degree burns on face, hands, or feet. That's all considered critically severe burns. Okay, switching from burns to cancer. And again, we touched very briefly that, we could have an entire course on just cancer. But carcinogenesis, that's the development of cancer. This is usually a very gradual process. It can happen quicker or slower, but it's not really an overnight kind of thing. And cancer, that's just an abnormal cell growth or abnormal cell mass. We have benign tumors. And this is that it's not cancerous, but it is a tumor. And we say that the neoplasm is abnormal. So that growth is not normal. But it's not spreading out of control around the body. It's encapsulated, it takes up space, but it's contained. A malignant tumor, that is that it doesn't have this capsule. And so it can spread all over the body. It metastasizes or spreads. So it invades other tissues and organs. And that is, cancer as we know it. That's the dangerous part. So when we're talking about the skin, what kind of cancers are we seeing? Well, you can get basal cell carcinoma. This is the least malignant. It's the most common. It's mostly, if you go to a dermatologist, what they're sort of looking for, and they can just remove. It's when we get the stratum basale cells that are over proliferating, they're invading the dermis and the hypodermis. These are really slow growing. They're not really metastasizing, and they can be cured by surgical excision 99% of the time. And again, if you go to a dermatologist and they say that you need a growth removed, and they do it in office right there, this is usually the type of cancer that they're easily removing. Then we move up to squamous cell carcinoma. This is happening in the stratum spinosum, in those keratinocytes. This is happening a lot in scalp, in ears, lower lips. It can grow pretty rapidly, and it will metastasize if you do not catch it in time. But it does have a very good prognosis as long as you catch it and you treat it by surgically removing it and or radiation. Then there's melanoma. This is the most dangerous type of skin cancer. It's cancer in the melanocytes. It is very likely to metastasize, and it is very resistant to chemotherapy. That being said, there has been a lot of strides, kind of recently in fighting melanoma. And I know of several people in my personal life that have been treated and have, successfully caught it in time. but they did have rather extensive surgeries to remove the margins of their melanoma. So definitely something you want to be checking. You want to be seeing a dermatologist. Everyone should be wearing sunscreen if you're outside, regardless of, how darkly pigmented your skin is, because skin cancer can affect everyone. Um, and here are some sort of rules that have been going around for decades now, about watching different growths on your skin and, trying to see if you can catch these things, in time so that you can have them removed and, not suffer from cancer. And it's the ABCDE rule. A is you're looking at asymmetry. The two sides of the pigment area don't match up. So a lot of these growths are going to be in this like sort of circular oval shape, and they're not really going to be fuzzy with their borders. So if it's really oddly shaped, definitely something to get checked out because asymmetry is sort of a warning sign. The border, is it a nice, precise border or is it really fuzzy? And all over the place. So it shouldn't really have indentation or irregular shape to it. The color, and this will a little bit depend on your skin tone, but is it really very different than the other markings on your body? Is it really brown or black? Does it look red or blue? Is the color multiple colors in one growth? That's a warning sign. D is for diameter. Is it larger than 6 millimeters, like a pencil eraser or a pen cap top? Um, if it's large, that's concerning. But there are areas that are small that are still malignant. So, you want to take all of these together. And then E is evolve, and that's does it change? So you might notice a spot, a mole, a freckle, a growth, and you're like, oh, okay, that's, that happened, but it looks the same as it did, 6 months or a year ago. That's maybe nothing to be concerned about. But if it starts to develop and change, evolve, that would be concerning and should be checked out. Treatment is widely just surgical excision of the spot, and trying to get the margins around it, and then some sort of immunotherapy. And melanoma is kind of scary in that the survival is poor if the lesion is over 4